Why Alex Jones confirms that dollar collapse on September 27, 2016. Why dollar collapse is guaranteed on September 27, 2016. What will happen to you when the dollar collapses? Historically, when a nation's debt exceeds its ability to repay even the interest, it can be assumed that the currency will collapse. This collapse will be global and it will bring down not only the dollar but all other fiat currencies, as they are fundamentally no different. The collapse of currencies will lead to the collapse of all paper assets. The repercussions to this will have incredible results worldwide. Historically, when a nation's debt exceeds its ability to repay even the interest, it can be assumed that the currency will collapse. Typically, governments exacerbate the situation by printing large amounts of currency notes in an effort to inflate the problem away, or at least postpone it. The greater the level of debt, the more dramatic the inflation must be to counter it. The more dramatic the inflation, the greater the danger that hyperinflation will take place. No government has ever been able to control hyperinflation. If it occurs, it does so quickly and always ends with a crash. Although there are observers, myself included, who frequently discuss what a reserve currency crash would mean to the world, there is little or no discussion as to how this would impact people on the street level, and perhaps that discussion should begin. When currencies crash, the state often tries to float a new currency. Sometimes, it's accepted, sometimes not. Generally, the people of the country, and those trading within the country, move immediately to the next best thing. In 2009, when the Zimbabwe dollar crashed, several currencies were used, but the US dollar was the clear favorite, as it was the world's reserve currency and therefore the most spendable currency. Not surprisingly, the Zimbabwean government fought the use of the dollar, as they wanted to retain control of the economy and the people. People were therefore penalized for using the US dollar and other currencies. And that's what most governments do, but here's where that idea usually falls down. First, the black market currency is so desired by the now jaded citizens that they do all they can to avoid the new official currency. Soon, most transactions, although illegal, are undertaken in the black market currency. Second, since no one really wants the new currency, even the political leaders are soon using the black market currency. Ultimately, the black market currency is legalized, since it's the only truly workable solution, and it often becomes the unofficial currency, if not actually the official one. First, the euro crash. It's safe to say that the EU, the US, and quite a few other jurisdictions are nearing currency crashes, and in all likelihood, the euro will go before the dollar. So, unless the EU has already prearranged a new euro, the US dollar might well be chosen as an immediate solution to the problem, as the US dollar is presently recognized and traded throughout Europe. Therefore, a relatively painless transfer could be made. Then, the dollar crash. However, the dollar, which is presently praised as being a sound currency, is really only sound in relation to the euro, and some other lesser currencies. Once its less stable brother, the euro, collapses, the dollar will be exposed. As the US dollar is a fiat currency and is on the ropes, the US, and any other country that is using the dollar as its primary currency when the time comes, will experience a currency emergency at the street level that will be unprecedented. The big question that is generally not being discussed is, the day after the crash, and thereafter, what will be the currency that is used to buy a bag of groceries, a tank of petrol, a meal at a restaurant? Certainly, the need will be immediate and will be on a national level in each impacted country, affecting everyone. And then, I have discussed for some time that the US will be prepared ahead of time with a new, electronic currency. This will serve three purposes. It will allow the US government to blame paper currencies for the crash, in order to distract the public from recognizing that the government itself is the culprit. It will allow the US government to create a currency system that disallows the holding of tradable currency by the population, that is, a debit card would be created by banks through which all transactions must pass, assuring that all transactions are processed by, and thereby subject to the control of, a bank. It will allow the U.S. government to have knowledge of every penny earned and spent by any individual or organization, allowing for direct debit income taxation. If the U.S. does institute such a system, U.S. citizens will then become the most economically controlled people in the world, overnight. It's likely that a black market system would spontaneously be created by U.S. citizens in order to bypass the new government system. A portion of daily trade would occur under the table. It would unquestionably be made illegal, and we can only speculate as to how prevalent it would become. 10% of all transactions? 30%? Anyone's guess. Certainly, the government would crack down, and penalties might become severe. Elsewhere in the world, there would be greater freedom, but what would their currencies be? There are many countries that presently use the US dollar as one of their official currencies. After a crash, the greater the link to the US dollar, the greater the loss of economic freedom, although, in most such countries, the government is likely to be less efficient than in the US, which would work in favor of the individual. Such countries would also have the option of switching from the dollar to another dominant currency. With the euro and dollar gone, that currency might be the Chinese yuan. The difficulty with this possibility is that, presently, the yuan is not in common use on the street. Adoption of a currency such as the yuan would require a sudden switch in monetary policy, complete with teething problems. However, recent developments amongst the BRICS and others indicate that many countries are already seeing the writing on the wall and are readying themselves for the use of the yuan as an alternate. A return to precious metals as currency? A further possibility is taking place in Mexico today. Mexico is remonetizing silver. A 1-ounce pure silver Libertad coin will function in parallel to, and be interchangeable with, the existing paper peso. Banks will value the Libertad daily, based upon the silver price. Thus, Mexico will create a legal way for its citizens to protect themselves against devaluation of the peso, whilst creating an internal protection against currency crashes in other countries. If the Mexican government remains consistent in its plan, it will do more than simply help stabilize Mexico economically. It will serve as an example to other countries that when the Goliaths of the euro and US dollar fall, there is a very sound alternative. Further, the more countries that follow this policy, the more silver, and for that matter, gold, would become an international currency. It would matter little to a petrol station owner in Canada, Australia, or Chile whether his till was filled with coins marked Mexico, or whether they said Iceland, New Zealand, or South Africa. After all, an ounce of silver is an ounce of silver, no matter what the issuing country is. As the great unraveling proceeds, we would be wise to monitor what happens with the Libertad in Mexico and watch for a similar return to precious metals in other jurisdictions. As this development progresses, we might wish to consider that, whatever jurisdictions are the most forceful in demanding the continued use of doomed paper currencies, or, worse, transferring into electronic currencies, we may choose to store our wealth, no matter how great or small, in a safer jurisdiction. Further, we may choose to reside in a jurisdiction where a currency crisis will be less likely to occur, to live under a government that does not seek to monitor and tax our every economic transaction. Is the dollar about to collapse? The internet is rife with musings that the US dollar is about to be replaced as the world's reserve currency. I have also heard rumblings about its inevitable collapse. Are these mere conspiracy theories or is there hard evidence to support these claims? To add to the confusion, many of those predicting these dire events are well-known, public figures. Are they correct or is this a ploy to capture media headlines? Let's explore these claims. The dollar as the reserve currency. Background. The US dollar replaced the British pound sterling as the world's reserve currency around 1945. It occurred for a number of reasons. The US economy was the global leader in manufacturing and held the majority of the world's gold. According to sources I've read, the dollar was the only currency still backed by gold. There was a downside to this. When the Great Depression hit the US in the 1930s, because the country was still on the gold standard, the Federal Reserve could only increase the money supply, i.e. to lessen the severity of the depression, to the extent there was gold to back it up. It should also be noted that the depression wasn't confined to America, as many other nations were suffering the same fate. In 1944, a majority of the world's central bankers met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire to discuss the creation of a new global monetary system. One goal was to create a system to facilitate trade between nations. To accomplish this, they needed a strong common currency that could be used in international trading. Hence, the dollar was chosen. They also decided that the value of other currencies would be tied to the dollar and that the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. What does it mean to be the world's reserve currency? Reserve currency, function. A reserve currency is a common currency used when countries trade with one another. Because the dollar was chosen, other countries would maintain a healthy supply of dollars. Being the reserve currency creates stronger demand for the dollar, which helps support its value. Even so, the value of the dollar will fluctuate based on a variety of other conditions, including actions taken by the Federal Reserve. For example, when the Fed expands the money supply, the value of the dollar tends to fall. When the dollar declines, it helps boost U.S. exports. This is because a weaker dollar makes our goods cheaper to the rest of the world. Moreover, exports are a component of total GDP, though not a very significant one. The dollar trended lower from mid-2001 through mid-2008, periods approximate. In August 2014 the dollar began to strengthen. Why? Because the Fed had signaled its intention to discontinue its monetary expansion, which it finally did on October 29, 2014. Less supply equates to a higher valuation. A stronger dollar equates to additional problems, but that's a topic for another time. Will the dollar lose its status? What would occur if the dollar was replaced as the world's reserve currency? There are several possibilities. For example, countries holding the dollar might sell. If every nation sold their supply of dollars at the same time, the market would be flooded with dollars, which could cause its value to plummet. This would cause inflation to spike. The degree of inflation depends on the severity of the dollar's decline. On the bright side, the Fed is no longer expanding the money supply, so at least one catalyst for a weaker dollar is absent. There are several scenarios that could potentially sink the dollar. However, to suggest that the dollar will be replaced, one must ask the question, with what? Even with our debt and fiscal issues, what other currency has the status to become the new reserve currency? Certainly not the euro with all the problems across the pond. Surely not the Chinese yuan with their economy in severe contraction, something that's been expected for a while. The gossip I've read on the internet, if it's on the internet, it must be true, is that the IMF is going to create a new reserve currency this October. Is this a real possibility? If you think it is, perhaps I could interest you in some swampland down in the bayou. In my view, although the US certainly has its share of self-inflicted woes, the dollar should retain its status a while longer. To borrow a line from Samuel Clemens, the report of its demise may be an exaggeration. A dollar collapses when the value of the US dollar plummets. Anyone who holds dollar-denominated assets will sell them at any cost. The biggest holders are foreign governments who own US treasuries. They also include traders in exchange rate futures who trade the dollar versus other currencies. Last but not least are individual investors. When the crash occurs, they will demand assets denominated in anything other than dollars. The collapse of the dollar means that everyone is trying to sell their dollar-denominated assets, and no one wants to buy them. They will drive the value of the dollar down to near zero. It makes hyperinflation look like a day in the park. Why? The US debt nearly tripled during that time period, from $5.9 trillion to $15 trillion. The debt is even worse now, at $19 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio is now more than 100%. That increases the chance the United States will let the dollar's value slide. That would allow it to repay its debt with cheaper money. Second, there must be a viable currency alternative for everyone to stampede into. The dollar's strength is based on its use as the world's reserve currency. That happened in 1973 when President Nixon abandoned the gold standard. As a global currency, the dollar is used for 43% of all cross-border transactions. That means central banks must hold the dollar in their reserves to pay for these transactions. As a result, 61% of these foreign currency reserves are in dollars. Here's the 3 ways to measure the value of the US dollar. If the dollar lost its status, what is the next most popular currency? The euro. But it comprises less than 30% of central bank reserves. The Eurozone debt crisis has only weakened the euro as a viable alternative to the dollar as a global currency. China and others argue that a new currency should be created and used as the global currency. China's central banker goes one step further. He claims that the yuan should replace the dollar to maintain China's economic growth. However, replacing the dollar would be a massive undertaking, would require great global resolve, and not happen quickly. China is right to be alarmed at the dollar's drop in value. That's because it is the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasuries, and it just saw its investment deteriorate. For more, see dollar to yuan conversion and history. Could Bitcoin replace the dollar as the new world currency? It has many benefits. It's not controlled by any one country's central bank. It is created, managed, and spent online. But it can also be used at brick-and-mortar stores that accept it. Its supply is finite. That appeals to those who would rather have a currency that's backed by something concrete, such as gold. There are big obstacles, however. First, its value is highly volatile. That's because there is no central bank to manage it. Second, it has become the coin of choice for illegal activities that lurk in the deep web. That makes it vulnerable to tampering by unknown forces. What event could trigger a collapse? A dollar collapse would not occur unless the third condition were also met. That's a huge, triggering event that would destroy confidence in the dollar. Altogether, foreign countries own more than $5 trillion in U.S. debt. If China, Japan, or other major holders started dumping these holdings of treasury notes on the secondary market, this could cause a panic leading to collapse. China owns more than $1 trillion in U.S. treasuries. That's because China pegs its currency, the yuan, to the dollar. This keeps the prices of its exports to the U.S. relatively cheap. Japan owns more than $800 billion in treasuries, also keeping its currency, the yen, low to stimulate exports to the U.S. Japan is trying to move out of a 15-year deflationary cycle, and the 2011 earthquake and nuclear disaster hasn't helped. Would China and Japan ever really do this? Only if they saw their holdings declining in value too fast and they had another market to sell their products to. The economies of Japan and China are dependent on U.S. consumers. They know that if they sell their dollars, their products will cost more in the U.S., and their economies will suffer. Right now, it's still in their best interest to hold onto their dollar reserves. China and Japan are selling more to other Asian countries, who are gradually becoming wealthier. However, the U.S. is still the best market in the world. See demand in the U.S. economy. When will the dollar collapse? A dollar collapse will not occur in 2016. In fact, it's highly unlikely that it will collapse at all. That's because any of the countries who have the power to make that happen, China, Japan, and other foreign dollar holders, don't want it to occur. It's not in their best interest. Why bankrupt your best customer? Instead, the dollar will probably continue to decline gradually, as these countries slowly find other markets. For more, see dollar decline or dollar collapse. What would happen after a collapse? A sudden dollar collapse would create global economic turmoil. Investors would rush to other currencies, such as the euro, or other assets, such as gold and commodities. Demand for treasuries would plummet, and interest rates would rise. U.S. import prices would skyrocket, causing inflation. U.S. exports would be dirt cheap, boosting the economy briefly. In the long run, inflation, high interest rates, and volatility would strangle possible business growth. Unemployment would worsen, sending the US back into recession or even creating a depression. How to protect yourself? Protect yourself from a dollar collapse by first defending yourself from a gradual dollar decline. Keep your assets well diversified by holding foreign mutual funds, gold and other commodities. A dollar collapse would create global economic turmoil. To respond to this kind of uncertainty, you must be mobile. Keep your assets liquid, so you can shift them as needed. Make sure your job skills are transferable. Update your passport, in case things get so bad for so long that you need to move quickly to another country. For more, see Dollar Collapse, How to Protect Yourself and Survive. If the US dollar collapsed, which countries would be the safest to live in? In the event that the dollar collapses, which countries would be safest to live in terms of job availability, little to no social unrest and good availability of food and water? My guesses are UAE, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, India, and Turkey. Please correct me if I'm wrong and I appreciate the answers. Over the last few days, there has been a number of articles in the media about the steady decline of the dollar US against the euro. While many economists have forecasted the possibility of the dollar declining against the euro for some time, most do not comprehend the significance of this. Some believe that the decline of the dollar against the currencies of Americans' trading partners will help correct the USA's trade deficit, and the dollar will stop falling when the trade imbalance is corrected. However, the evidence is that the opposite is happening. The dollar US has declined 40% against the euro over the last 2 years, and during this time America's trade deficit has continues to deteriorate. There is now nothing the USA can do to prevent the collapse of its currency and its economy. It has no reserves to support its value, and has the most indebted country in the world, is dependent of the credit from America's former enemies. Over the last couple of days, both Russia and China have said they will be switching their considerable dollar reserves into euro. This will only hasten the lack of confidence in the dollar, creating a global lack of confidence in the currency, and setting into free fall. It will soon bring about the total collapse of the dollar, and the American economy. The collapse of the dollar will throw the world into a global depression. Those nations with large external debts will not be able to trade sufficiently to earn the income to service their debts, and will slide into bankruptcy. The economies of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK will also totally collapse, as a result of their indebtedness and not being able to service their borrowings. It will result in the Anglo-Saxon nations facing abject poverty, our people facing starvation, and a total breakdown in society. Crime will become rampant. Law and order will cease to exist. Disease will become widespread. The Asian economies, which have depended upon American trade, will also be severely affected. However, they will recover after a period, but only after considerable political and economic turmoil. The EU will be in a much better position to survive the coming economic chaos. An influx of capital into the Eurozone by those selling dollars will provide the funding for rebuilding the economies of the new United States of Europe. However, the collapse of the dollar US will still severely affect the already depressed German and French economies. The resulting economic turmoil will create the need for the acceptance of a strong EU leader, who will be able to make the necessary political and economic reforms to enable Europe revive their economies. Those nations that accept the new EU constitution will come under the control of this new leader, creating Europe as the world's new superpower. The euro will become the world's only reserve currency, creating the means for the new United States of Europe to become the dominant economic power in the world. The new Europe will be able to dictate the terms on how the global economy should be run. They will take over the administration of America and Britain, placing the Anglo-Saxon people in bondage for repayment of their debts. Americans do not appear to comprehend the bitterness that has grown around the world as a result of their illegal invasion of Iraq. While once Europeans looked up to and admired America, today it is held in utter contempt for its arrogance and warmongering. Anti-European comments in the American media have only added to this hostility towards the U.S. America's attempt to impose its version of government on the world, its hypocrisy in claiming to be the moral leader of the world, while flooding the media with degenerate filth and garbage, has brought upon it disgust and contempt that few Americans can comprehend. The delegates there were acutely aware that the failures of the international monetary system after the First World War had contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War. They were determined to create a more stable system that would avoid beggar-thy-neighbor currency wars, trade wars, and other dysfunctions that could lead to shooting wars. It was at Bretton Woods that the dollar was officially designated the world's leading reserve currency, a position that it still holds today. Under the Bretton Woods system, all major currencies were pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The dollar itself was pegged to gold at the rate of $35 per ounce. Indirectly, the other currencies had a fixed gold value because of their peg to the dollar. Other currencies could devalue against the dollar, and therefore against gold, if they received permission from the International Monetary Fund, IMF. However, the dollar could not devalue, at least in theory. It was the keystone of the entire system, intended to be permanently anchored to gold. From 1950–1970 the Bretton Woods system worked fairly well. Trading partners of the U.S. who earned dollars could cash those dollars into the U.S. Treasury and be paid in gold at the fixed rate. Trading partners of the U.S. who earned dollars could cash those dollars into the U.S. Treasury and be paid in gold at the fixed rate. In 1950, the U.S. had about 20,000 tons of gold. By 1970, that amount had been reduced to about 9,000 tons. The 11,000 ton decline went to U.S. trading partners, primarily Germany, France, and Italy, who earned dollars and cashed them in for gold. The UK pound sterling had previously held the dominant reserve currency role starting in 1816, following the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the official adoption of the gold standard by the UK. Many observers assume the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference was the moment the US dollar replaced sterling as the world's leading reserve currency. In fact, that replacement of sterling by the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency was a process that took 30 years, from 1914 to 1944. The real turning point was the period July–November 1914, when a financial panic caused by the start of the First World War led to the closures of the London and New York stock exchanges and a mad scramble around the world to obtain gold to meet financial obligations. At first, the United States was acutely short of gold. The New York Stock Exchange was closed so that Europeans could not sell U.S. stocks and convert the dollar sales proceeds into gold. But within a few months, massive U.S. exports of cotton and other agricultural produce to the UK produced huge trade surpluses. Gold began to flow the other way, from Europe back to the U.S. Wall Street banks began to underwrite massive war loans for the UK and France. By the end of the First World War, the U.S. had emerged as a major creditor nation and a major gold power. The dollar's percentage of total global reserves began to soar. Scholar Barry Eichengreen has documented how the dollar and sterling seesawed over the 20 years following the First World War, with one taking the lead from the other as the leading reserve currency and in turn giving back the lead. In fact, the period from 1919–1939 was really one in which the world had two major reserve currencies, dollars and sterling, operating side by side. Finally, in 1939, England suspended gold shipments in order to fight the Second World War, and the role of sterling as a reliable store of value was greatly diminished apart from the U.K.'s special trading zone of Australia, Canada, and other Commonwealth nations. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference was merely recognition of a process of dollar reserve dominance that had started in 1914. The significance of the process by which the dollar replaced sterling over a 30-year period has huge implications for you today. Slippage in the dollar's role as the leading global reserve currency is not necessarily something that would happen overnight, but is more likely to be a slow, steady process. Signs of this are already visible. In 2000, dollar assets were about 70% of global reserves. Today, the comparable figure is about 62%. If this trend continues, one could easily see the dollar fall below 50% in the not-too-distant future. It is equally obvious that a major creditor nation is emerging to challenge the US today, just as the US emerged to challenge the UK in 1914. That power is China. The US had massive gold inflows from 1914 to 1944. China has massive gold inflows today. Officially, China reports that it has 1,054 metric tons of gold in its reserves. However, these figures were last updated in 2009, and China has acquired thousands of metric tons since without reporting these acquisitions to the IMF or World Gold Council. Based on available data on imports and the output of Chinese mines, it is possible to estimate that actual Chinese government and private gold holdings exceed 8,500 metric tons, as shown in the chart below. Assuming half of this is government-owned, with the other half in private hands, then the actual Chinese government gold position exceeds 4,250 metric tons, an increase of over 300%. Of course, these figures are only estimates, because China operates through secret channels and does not officially report its gold holdings except at rare intervals. The dollar collapse will be the single largest event in human history. This will be the first event that will touch every single living person in the world. Collapse. Typically, governments exacerbate the situation by printing large amounts of currency notes in an effort to inflate the problem away, or at least postpone it. The greater the level of debt, the more dramatic the inflation must be to counter it. The more dramatic the inflation, the greater the danger that hyperinflation will take place. No government has ever been able to control hyperinflation. If it occurs, it does so quickly and always ends with a crash. Although there are observers, myself included, who frequently discuss what a reserve currency crash would mean to the world, there is little or no discussion as to how this would impact people on the street level, and perhaps that discussion should begin. When currencies crash, the state often tries to float a new currency. Sometimes, it's accepted, sometimes not. Generally, the people of the country, and those trading within the country, move immediately to the next best thing. In 2009, Why Alex Jones confirms that dollar collapse on September 27, 2016. Why dollar collapse is guaranteed on September 27, 2016. What will happen to you when the dollar collapses? Historically, when a nation's debt exceeds its ability to repay even the interest, it can be assumed that the currency will collapse. This collapse will be global and it will bring down not only the dollar but all other fiat currencies, as they are fundamentally no different. The collapse of currencies will lead to the collapse of all paper assets. The repercussions to this will have incredible results worldwide. Historically, when a nation's debt exceeds its ability to repay even the interest, it can be assumed that the currency will. The big question that is generally not being discussed is, the day after the crash, and thereafter, what will be the currency that is used to buy a bag of groceries, a tank of petrol, a meal at a restaurant? Certainly, the need will be immediate and will be on a national level in each impacted country, affecting everyone. And then, I have discussed for some time that the US will be prepared ahead of time with a new, electronic currency. This will serve three purposes. It will allow the US government to blame paper currencies for the crash, in order to distract the public from recognizing that the government itself is the culprit. It will allow the US government to create a currency system that disallows the holding of tradable currency by the population, that is, a debit card would be created by banks through which all transactions must pass, assuring that all transactions are processed by, and thereby subject to the control of, a bank. It will allow the US government to have knowledge of every penny earned and spent by any individual. First, the euro crash. It's safe to say that the EU, the US, and quite a few other jurisdictions are nearing currency crashes, and in all likelihood, the euro will go before the dollar. So, unless the EU has already prearranged a new euro, the US dollar might well be chosen as an immediate solution to the problem, as the US dollar is presently recognized and traded throughout Europe. Therefore, a relatively painless transfer could be made. Then, the dollar crash. However, the dollar, which is presently praised as being a sound currency, is really only sound in relation to the euro, and some other lesser currencies. Once its less stable brother, the euro, collapses, the dollar will be exposed. As the US dollar is a fiat currency and is on the ropes, the US, and any other country that is using the dollar as its primary currency when the time comes, will experience a currency emergency at the street level that will be unprecedented. When the Zimbabwe dollar crashed, several currencies were used, but the US dollar was the clear favorite, as it was the world's reserve currency and therefore the most spendable currency. Not surprisingly, the Zimbabwean government fought the use of the dollar, as they wanted to retain control of the economy and the people. People were therefore penalized for using the US dollar and other currencies. And that's what most governments do, but here's where that idea usually falls down. First, the black market currency is so desired by the now jaded citizens that they do all they can to avoid the new official currency. Soon, most transactions, although illegal, are undertaken in the black market currency. Second, since no one really wants the new currency, even the political leaders are soon using the black market currency. Ultimately, the black market currency is legalized, since it's the only truly workable solution, and it often becomes the unofficial currency, if not actually the official one.